Hey, what's up you guys, The Curious Owl here, and today I have my review for Shadow Kiss by Richelle Mead. Shadow Kiss is the third book in the Vampire Academy series, and my thoughts on this are going to go into some spoilery content for the first two books, so if you have not read the first two books, please make sure to go read those first because this is, like I said, going to contain some spoilery content. Shadow Kiss picks up about 3 weeks to a month after the events of Frostbite, where Rose unfortunately had lost a friend of hers named Mason. He was killed by some Strigoi that had kidnapped him, Rose, and a few other people. And she's dealing with a lot of the emotional grief that comes with that because she blames herself in a lot of ways for what happened to Mason. On top of that, she still has been dealing with the feelings that she has for her guardian trainer, Dimitri. This has been feelings she's been having since book one, and in this book in particular, we see a massive amount of growth in terms of the relationship between Rose and Dimitri. Along with that, Rose is still having to deal with the kind of back and forth nature that there is with her relationship with her best friend Lissa. Rose has been able to, for a long time, link into Lissa ever since that they were in a car accident where basically Rose had become what's called a shadow-kissed person, meaning that she had died and Lissa had brought her back to life, and so because of that, she's kind of got one foot in both the real world and in the kind of more afterlife because of the fact that she died and came back. And in this book, we actually learn that there are some other things that are happening in terms of things that Rose is starting to see, and she's not sure whether it is a telepathic bond or if it is playing on all of the grief and the trauma she has endured over the last 6 months or so of her life. Within this book too, we learn that there is finally some progress being made in the case about Victor Dashkoff. Now, Victor was a family friend of Lissa's that essentially in the first book we learn was out to get Lissa's powers to be used for his own gain. Lissa, for her entire life, has been able to use spirit, essentially, and it's a very rare form of magic that vampires can do. Basically, Lissa is able to restore life and heal and various other things with her powers, and Victor Dashkoff in the first book had kidnapped Lissa to use her as a way for him to prolong his own life when he was dying of sickness. And he was about to do it by any means necessary and was planning on also using her to spearhead a revolution that started to take place actually kind of on its own in the course of the book Frostbite and further into Shadow Kiss here. What happens in this book though is that the trial of Victor Dashkoff finally comes around and it brings up a lot of issues with Rose and Lissa who have had to deal with him. Rose in particular though had basically been kind of fooled by Victor, where essentially he had placed a lust charm on her and Dimitri, causing them in the first book to nearly have sex. And this was used as a distraction to get Rose to get away from Lissa so that he could kidnap her. And Rose and Dimitri are both worried that he is likely to bring this up in his trial to maybe cast blame on somebody else for their incompetence as opposed to the true amount of blame that should be placed on Victor himself. There's a lot of moving parts within this book, and I think that generally these books are actually really interesting with all these moving parts. I will say I think this book did suffer a little bit from middle book syndrome because while I still really enjoyed this and have confirmed that this is the book that I did stop at originally when I was reading this series for the first time, I did feel like this book was a little harder to come back to every now and then, mostly because I felt that there were some things that didn't necessarily drag per se, but weren't as interesting maybe. I didn't feel as much of a pull to this to read it in like one sitting idea like I had with Vampire Academy and Frostbite. With both of those books, the time passed very quickly that I hadn't realized I read large chunks of those books. This time, while I didn't necessarily feel like I read large chunks every time, for some reason this did feel a little bit slower, and I think it is because that this book actually so far is the biggest of the 3 books that I've read so far. This book is 443 pages, whereas both books 1 and 2 were under 400. Now, whether or not that really plays a difference into the overall pacing and attention grabbingness I had toward it, I'm not sure. I felt like this kind of did more where it has that middle book problem where instead of it having its own massive plot line, kind of like how Frostbite and Vampire Academy did, this definitely was more so the setup for the other books in the series. Now, the end of this story really brings in a very, very important topic in terms of the second half of this series, in terms of what we should expect and or where exactly things are going. So I do think that that was great. But again, I feel that this one, for some reason, while books 1 and 2 necessarily didn't have as cohesive of a plot as most other books would have, because there's so many threads, this had even less of one, and because it was playing on all of the threads that had come up over the course of books 1 and 2. With that being said though, I still really, really enjoyed this just as much as I did the other 2 books. I just really think that this one was more so that bridge between the first half and the second half. This is very much kind of that cliffhanger, in a sense, act ending kind of idea. Like books 1 through 3 are act 1, then books 4 through 6 are act 2 of this entire series. I think this is definitely supposed to be more of the wrap up of the first part of the series, and because of that, I think it did suffer in some ways by not having that extensively cohesive idea. Like I said, the plot threads were good, they were great progressions, but nothing really came to a full, this is the main plot of the story, this is the main idea kind of thing. So with that, I did give this, like I said, a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it a lot. I definitely think it is worth the time, because honestly, some things were really amazing here. Like, there were so many things that I think we had been waiting to happen that came up in this one, and the wait really paid off in terms of the, again, plot progression, the threads being progressed. Some threads were finally explained to some extent, to where now we finally have some concrete answers for things that we've been questioning since book 1. So if you guys have read Shadowkiss yourself and have some thoughts on it, please let me know what they are down in the comments below. I'd love to have a conversation on this, because I feel like this series is definitely underrated, because as cheesy as it may seem for a kind of mid-2000s, early 2010s YA vampire fantasy, it's actually like not that bad. I'm actually getting to a point where like I'm seeing that this series still has a lot of great things about it. Now that we're getting to the second half of the series, I'm curious to see what exactly happens, because starting with the next book, Blood Promise, it is all new territory for me. I have not read the other 3 books in this series, and so I'm curious to see what my thoughts are of them now, reading them for the very, very first time ever. Thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!